Why hello there, YouTube. Welcome to the second video talking about my Hyperlight Drifter costume. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the cape. Obviously one of the biggest, it's the majority of the costume. It's like easily 75% of the costume. The color is pretty self-explanatory for the red, but for the rest of it, the character's cape is kind of like a peach pink sort of color. I found a piece of fabric that more or less matched up with this called Summerberry Punch, which sort of looked a little bit more neon than I thought it should, but as soon as I got it next to the red fabric on the rest of the cape, the red kind of mellowed it out. So, that all looks pretty on the spot there. The cape is built in about 5 different pieces that I actually built onto a t-shirt, a really old t-shirt that I needed to get rid of anyway. And then I cut the t-shirt out from under it, so there's just a little bit of that holding the cape together way underneath it in the shoulder, where it's pretty much invisible. As for the 5 pieces I was referring to there, there's the pink under cape, there's the red majority of the cape. I sort of did 2 separate shoulder pieces with the fringe on it, and then a neck piece. And on the neck piece, I actually very specifically tried to get the hole for my head as small as possible. It turns out that was not necessarily the way to go. Not because it's hard to get into, because, well, we all must struggle for our art, but the tighter neck hole tends to make the veil around the lower half of my face bunch up around my chin, and it just looks weird. So just as a piece of advice for anybody else working on one of these costumes, the neck hole doesn't have to be that small. It's good life advice for anybody, really. The black X holding the front of the cape together isn't actually holding anything together, but it was a detail I wanted to add, as it was on, not all the concept art for the character, but it was a neat little detail I thought I'd include. And there's rivets on it just because, well, rivets are actually a really good mechanical way to hold stuff together. It's kind of becoming a theme on the costume for me. There were no rivets in the original design of the character, but rivets are cool, so I'll just leave those on there. The yellow diamond hanging from this black X is one of the pieces I actually took a lot more artistic license with. I had this yellow quartz crystal, which is to say chemically tinted quartz, that I picked up at a tourist location. It's been sitting on my desk for a while, and when I started building this, I really wanted to use that for this yellow diamond in some way. So what I did is I built the profile of the yellow diamond around this out of clear plastic from a software game case, and then filled everything in with hot glue and added, those like clear plastic dividers they have for notebooks? I just added the yellow one of those onto the outside of it and used the hot glue gun to kind of heat shrink it on there. It worked pretty good, and it's all fairly translucent, so when I added an LED to the back of it, it all lights up really well and kind of shows off some of the internal detail. Originally, I wanted to add some sort of like circuitry-looking wiring to the top of it to go with Hyperlight Drifter's theme of ancient technology, but after I got it put together, it already felt a little bit too busy, and I thought the wire would just kind of make that worse. It is in fact not a perfect diamond. The back of it's kind of been flattened, first of all to make it a lot easier to fit the light in there, but also so that it sits on my chest a lot flatter. When it was to a sharp point, it tended to just kind of flop left and right and kind of sit not on the corner and just not look so good. Now, the back of it still doesn't look real good. I need to work on that a little bit, but that may have to wait until I get a couple other projects out of the way. All right, the next piece I want to talk about is the lower half of the costume, which I don't necessarily have a good name for. The butt cape, the comma, I don't know what you want to call it. I need to add a little bit more onto the belt because I need to build in a holster for the gun, and, a scabbard for the sword, or at least something to put the sword through when I don't want to carry it, so it can kind of sit on my hip. I need to add a little bit more detail to the belt buckle so it doesn't look like I just pulled it off of a backpack. I totally just pulled it off of a backpack. I'm just going to leave the rivets because rivets. The leather loincloth thing I got going on the front of it is black leather glued onto the top of gray leather in a pattern that I just sort of made up looking at the pattern on the loincloth during the cinematic and one of the earlier drawings of the loincloth. I just kind of drew something halfway in between the two and maybe a little bit off to the side. I'm pretty happy with it. It's not a bad looking pattern. All right, next the boots. Now, there's not a whole lot to these. They're really just a cheap pair of boot toppers I got from a store on Halloween with sort of a gray cuff glued onto the top of them, made out of actual leather. The actual leather on top of, cheap vinyl looks a little bit weird and mismatched, but all in all, it's probably fine. There's not going to be a whole lot of people staring at my feet. All right, the next part I want to talk about is the gauntlets, or the bracers, or whatever you want to call them. Most of the drawings of the character don't tend to say a whole lot specifically about the bracers. They just sort of suggest an arm shape. About the only consistent detail they have is sort of the raised edge around the wrist, or this sort of square cuff kind of thing. So I very specifically added that. Most of the drawings of this have a single teal light, halfway up the forearm, which I of course added. There's a little bit more detail I want to add to that. The little black thing is just kind of a placeholder while I figure out something else for that. Now, there was a drawing that was on their Kickstarter page for a while, where instead of this single teal light, which is kind of where their design for this is gone, they had sort of a couple of red glowing rings on the bracer, and a couple little red details on the side, which I kind of want to reference. I sort of want to add those as a little bit of extra detail on the bracer, because costumes are always cooler with extra little details. Now, the two most interesting parts of the costume that I wanted to talk about, the gun and the sword. So for the gun, what I used was a Nerf Recon CS6, at least the base part of it, because it's, got attachments and whatever. But the base gun itself is very square, which, is really what, pretty similar to the pistol, at least what they show in the inventory screen. And I painted it as accordingly as I could. It's not a one-to-one match, but it's pretty close. It has been rendered entirely non-functional for convention purposes. They don't want you taking live Nerf guns into a con, so that was just the thing to do. So here's the part I was most wanting to talk with you guys about, the sword. Something I've been working on for... It's been taking up most of my time on the costume, mostly because I screwed up the electronics twice and had to get some help sorting that out. I made the blade out of clear plastic from a Tupperware container that just happened to be the right color. As for the shape of the blade, I kind of went with the silhouette of the sword in the opening cinematic and just kind of played around with that a little bit, where I added these sort of raised pieces of plastic, the idea of which, I guess, being that the plasma that makes up the sword kind of swirls around a little bit before it coalesces into the hard lightsaber. And all in all, the shape of it is like vaguely reminiscent of like a basket-hilted rapier, but I really like it. I think it looks cool. The handle itself is maybe a little bit too busy, but overall I think I'm happy with it. It felt like it needed a little bit of iconography on it, so I added Heart Machine's logo onto the end of the laser sword emitter thing. Most of the rest of this is just built around the toy laser sword I bought to power this whole thing. I really like the color that I chose for this, as the teal of the blade and the maroon of the handle really makes it feel like it came from Hyperlight Drifter. Makes it feel sort of distinct to that game's world. Now who wants to see me wearing all this and dancing around like an idiot? And there you have it, folks. Thank you guys for watching my video. If you have any questions about anything I used on this or a process, just leave it for me in the comments and I will answer as best as I can. Thanks again for your time, guys. I'll talk to you later.